Now, if we move on to Bigfoot, as I mentioned at the beginning, that very often people think of Bigfoot and they think of the Pacific Northwest forests and snow and Alaska and Canada and things like that. But there's a long tradition of Bigfoot reports in Texas, and you can find reports actually not too far from here around the Trinity River. There have been a lot of reports, and not too far from Ennis, places like that. One of the places where I've been on many occasions to investigate Bigfoot reports is a place called the Big Thicket. Now, the Big Thicket is a large, very, very large area of forest, not too far from the city of Houston. And there are a lot of reports of Bigfoot-type creatures having been made in the Big Thicket. And a friend of mine named Rob Riggs wrote a book about all this. And if you want to get hold of it, it's called In the Big Thicket. And it's like a 200-page book all about these Texas Bigfoot reports in that particular area. And as I said, I've been down there a number of occasions, and people say to me, well, how could something sort of 6 to 7 feet tall remain hidden from us? Well, when you get to the Big Thicket and you actually sort of realise the sheer scale and density of it, then you also begin to realise how, nature can hide things. I mean, first time I went down there was like the summer. It was like 100 degrees and you just get bitten to pieces and cut to pieces going through the trees. So in other words, most people just don't bother going in there because they have no reason to. So in other words, that would make it much easier for creatures that don't want to be found to hang out specifically in the areas where, for example, they know people for the most part don't go. But on one of the occasions I was down there, this was actually a nighttime vigil we went on for a weekend. Although I didn't hear it, one of the team members, she actually heard something making a very loud, like a gorilla-like grunt, and it was sort of almost perceived as like a threat, just sort of a warning to sort of say keep away, that kind of thing. And you get a lot of accounts like that. Rob, for example, has found reports dating back to the 60s, and then the more he looked into it, he found reports from the 50s and the 40s, and then sort of going back to the turn of the century. So, in other words, these reports have existed for a long, long time. And I guess what's the strangest story from the Big Thicket is not of Bigfoot sightings, but there have been a number of reports, and they haven't really been investigated to a great degree, of people who claim to have seen what look like surviving pockets of ancient Native Americans. Now, when I say ancient Native Americans, I mean, obviously, there's a large population of Native Americans still in the US today, but we're talking about ones who still seem to sort of dress and use the same type of weapons as sort of 200-300 years ago. In other words, they become isolated and in these pockets, and literally, for all intents and purposes, as they were, as I said, a couple of hundred years ago, not changed at all. And there's actually a very strange story of a guy who got shot at. He saw one of these guys on a horse, and it looked just like somebody who would, if you had sort of an old photograph of a Native American on a horse sort of 120 years ago, and he suddenly heard this huge noise. Something hit the tree next to him, and it was like a crudely carved arrow, and he just sort of got out the area immediately. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on in the Big Thicket, which sort of suggests it's almost kind of out of time with all the different creatures it's got there. Now, as well as Bigfoot reports in Texas, we also get what I guess you would call wild man type reports, and talking about something more along the lines of like a Neanderthal man or a Cro-Magnon man, like a primitive human, but still covered in hair. And if you go back and look at some of the 19th century newspaper reports, this was long before the term Bigfoot was coined. The term Bigfoot wasn't created until the late 1950s. And people think, well, why wasn't it seen before? Well, it actually was, but it's just the name that didn't exist. The name Sasquatch, I think, goes back to something like 1920, Larry, is it? Something like that? Yeah. But even before that, they had reports of what became known as wild men. If you do a Google search, newspaper reports, 19th century wild men, you'll find literally dozens of accounts of people seeing these creatures. And in many cases, they do sound like Bigfoot. But there are other cases that they sound like something more like this, like something that looks far more clearly more humanoid, but still covered in hair. For example, there's a famous case of what's become known as the wild man of the Navidad. And this has like a long tradition. Again, it could be of a Bigfoot type creature or ongoing colonies of Bigfoot type creatures. But some of the early reports described, again, something that sounded more human-like. And in one case, the creature was reportedly seen carrying a club, like a fashioned wooden club, which again suggests some sort of fairly high degree of intelligence. And so, what do I think they are? I mean, maybe we're dealing with two different types of phenomena. You know, you do find these large sort of hairy ape type reports, and then we do find these more humanoid ones. Now, for example, you know, we can find this all around the world, where we get reports of wild men versus classic ape-type creatures. For example, in China, there's the Yeren, Australia has the Yowie, the US has Bigfoot. These are all traditional, large ape-type animals. But there's one in Russia that lives in the wilds of Russia known as the almasty. And in many of the reports, that actually does sound more like a very, very primitive human that may have survived from prehistoric times. And I don't rule out the idea that there could be isolated pockets of wild creatures, wild men, wild women, wild families, you know, just hiding out, oblivious to what's going on around them. You know, a lot of people think today's world's well-travelled and fully explored, but there are a lot of places that people just don't go to, you know, like the wilds of Siberia and the mountainous areas and some of the, you know, the jungles of South America. There could be certain things living out there that, you know, we just don't know about. Like, for example, on the island of Sumatra, we have reports of this creature known as the orang pendek, which is like a 3 to 4 foot tall ape-like animal, but it reportedly walks completely upright like a human. And people have who've seen it have said, you know, it sort of stops them in their tracks. You don't expect to see something that's ape-like but walking like a man. And there are actually a few reports of people claim to have seen these creatures carrying spears. So again, are we dealing with something that's an ape, or is it a human, or is it somewhere in between? Or more incredibly, could it be a completely unclassified type of human? Could some of these Texas ones, these primitive people, could it actually be something that we haven't classified? You know, we're Homo sapien. You know, before us there was Neanderthal man, Cro-Magnon man, and so on. Maybe some of these are one that literally has not yet been identified at all.